Tourism challenge from footprint to fund it, how tourism can tackle carbon from the ground up. So with the speaker, Charlie Cotton, founder of E-Collective, Daniel Quintana, Director of Marketing Untour Foundations, Lida Tiasiri, Design Director and Chief Sustainability Officer of Fan Designers, and moderated by the Professor Willy Legrand.
All right, so I guess this is my cue, isn't it?
Yes, it's yours.
It's my cue. Okay. Yeah, good morning. I say good morning or good afternoon, good evening. I'm saying good morning because I'm actually in Germany. It is morning and I have the sun in my face. So once again, congratulations to everyone today. This is it's pretty inspiring. So once again, my name is Willy Legrand. I'm a professor at the IU International University of Applied Sciences. This is located in Germany. And I have really a privilege to moderate today's panel. And the panel, as you can see, is called From Footprint to Funding. And I guess in that panel, we'll try to explore how tourism tackles the carbon challenges, all the way from grassroots innovations, we've heard about some today, to perhaps financial transformations. I've got three experts that are joining us today to decode or sort of that perhaps one of tourism's biggest challenge, so turning really awareness to action and obstacles into opportunities. And we heard from the winners today how that can be done. So as I said, we have our panelists, Daniel, Charlie, and Lydia. And I think the way we'll do it is we'll dive, before we dive into the deep end of it, we'll get to know each other a little bit more. So we'll do a quick round of personal introduction. So I'm going to go around. I'm going to say, can you please state your name again, your organization, what you do at the organization, and then in one sentence, perhaps what's the most surprising thing you've learned about carbon or sustainability in general in tourism this year? So let's start with you, Daniel. Daniel, you're here, and good morning.
Hey, good morning,
or
everyone.
Afternoon.
Good morning, everyone. And to follow up on what Willy was saying as well, good afternoon, good evening. For me, it's morning, Willy. I'm in Spain at the moment, but
Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Quintana. I'm the Director of Marketing at the Untours Foundation. We launched 3 years ago a impact investment fund for the tourism sector called the Reset Tourism Fund, which is bringing low interest capital to tourism SMEs around the world. So far, we've invested over $1.6 million into over 50 businesses around the world. I think for me, one of the biggest things that I've learned this year, and it was actually through our latest investment with alongside the EXO Foundation into a tourism business in Thailand, is just how much of carbon is emitted from long-tail boats in Thailand, around 44,000 tons of carbon every single year. So, it was a surprising fact to find out.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. And as you've heard, Daniel is going to be the one that's putting money behind the carbon solution. So we'll come back to you, Daniel, a little bit later today. Charlie, you're up.
Hello, everyone.
A quick intro and then something surprising about carbon sustainability this year.
Perfect. So I do two things. I measure the carbon footprint of travel companies, and then once I have those results, I try and find the smartest way for that company to reduce their emissions in the next year. We started the business about 6 years ago. We now currently work with around 100 or so travel companies doing those exact two jobs. The biggest thing I find surprising about carbon in the travel industry is how different a low carbon trip can be compared to a high carbon trip. I could go on a low carbon trip every single year for the rest of my life. And if I sum up all of those emissions from every single holiday, from every single year, it could still be smaller than a high carbon trip. The scales are extreme between the best and the worst of what the industry is offering. And what I love about it is that there are low carbon holidays already happening, showing that actually we can start to make the shift as of today, which I think is really cool.
That's great. Thanks. Well, we'll hear about it. Thanks so much. So for everyone, Charlie is the one that helps businesses to reduce the carbon footprint in a nutshell. You do more than that, of course, but that's in a nutshell. Lydia, you're up.
Hi, good afternoon from Bangkok, actually, on my end. So I'm Lydia Tiasiri from Fan Designers. My work is to bridge the gap between the architectural vision and genuine environmental performance. So I guide hotels from a full asset lifecycle, from built environment design all the way through material choices to unlock the information of embodied carbon, right through optimizing operational efficiencies and guiding end-of-life disposal processes. So we want to ensure that sustainability is integrated and not just some expensive afterthought. The most surprising thing about carbon and tourism this year is the financial risk of inaction. So just understanding that deep energy retrofits are now consistently a greater investment requirement. So this excuse of old, everything is too expensive when you want to be sustainable, I think that is the most surprising thing that is now being turned on its head, because there are now ways that are able to mitigate this.
That's great. That's perfect. Thank you so much for those quick insights. I think this is great, and it provides me with the perfect platform to move on. Lydia, let's just stay with you then. So you've just said it now. You work with hotels throughout the whole life, in a way, from planning, design, implementation. So what would you say are the biggest carbon blind spots you see in the hotel sector, where your owners, your operators, or perhaps your designers are getting it wrong without even realizing it? You've mentioned embodied carbon, perhaps that hints a little bit in some of this stuff. What are the blind spots, you would say?
So yeah, exactly. That is the question of the day right now. So from my perspective, I work as an auditor for operational sustainability. I work as a sustainable designer. So the biggest issue is that there are many owners and operators and designers, as you said, they're focusing on the very visible operational emissions that happen and being completely blind to the invisible embodied carbon of the build itself, which comes all the way before. So talking about embodied carbon, everyone is, wanting to talk about LEDs, low flow water fixtures, changing linen frequency, and it's great. But these are very, very minor wins. But the massive carbon debt you incur before the first guest even checks into this building is in the structure and the materials. So, for instance, you're creating a building and you're using, your material selections. If you choose something like virgin concrete and brand new steel, or something imported with a huge carbon, footprint that you're actually having to generate so much emissions for, if you see that, you're able to actually account for up to 70% of that embodied carbon of a project. So owners and operators are missing the fact that the carbon footprint itself is the greatest offender. And I would say the second blind spot is the handoff towards operations. So designers are specifying super high efficiency equipment, machines, technologies, and they aren't working very closely with the actual people who will use it, like the operations teams. So what happens is the engineers and the facility managers who then come on board, they want to run them, but they're actually just maintaining them. They don't know how to optimize them. And so you end up with a super high-tech system that's left on a manual or overridden format that becomes poorly maintained and completely negating energy efficiency gains. And the intent is right, but the execution is wrong, is what we're constantly feeling. So with owners and operators and designers, what's wrong, the main reason is that no one is sitting at the table from day one. So that is, something we're truly passionate about, championing an integrative design process. So making sure everyone is at the table at the concept stage to sort of try to mitigate all of these things, have these conversations up front, and we're not trying to, make big fixes that cost way more money later on in life.
I could imagine that some of the hoteliers are interested in doing those, I almost feel like saying quick fixes, because these are often things that guests see. And then when we talk about embodied carbon, which is super important, but in a way, I guess a little bit unknown, or perhaps people don't understand it, or they don't see it, they don't quite get it. I remember reading a research. I mean, I think we're getting more and more research on embodied carbon, especially in renovation stages and so on. And I mean, one of the things with hospitality, and I think you've mentioned it, is also the refurbishment, the renovation cycles that keep going at a faster rate and faster pace than ever, which means that your embodied carbon, you have spikes every, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years, whenever you do something, right? You probably that probably gets you nervous in some ways. I would imagine when that happens, when those, I mean, I would imagine it's big business, of course, but at the same time, this idea of embodied carbon is in the back of your mind with everything that's being thrown out of the hotels and everything that's being thrown back in. We can even talk about just mattresses, for example, right?
Exactly. I mean, that's why there's even circular projects now in terms of kind of a lease model where you can lease, mattresses and some OS&E for hotels, because they can then generate a proper circular loop and be recycled in parts by the mattress factories, for example, and come back.
Right. Yeah. Okay, very good. So we've opened the door. Let's keep on going. Charlie, through Ecollective, you go about measuring the carbon footprint of travel companies, and you've just mentioned it in your intro a little bit about this big amount, or you can do low carbon travel for all your life. And then anyways, how well do we understand the sources of carbon emissions by now? So we've just heard now in a hotel, we understand the energy, the LEDs, and the actual operational energy. It's a bit more complicated when it comes down to embodied carbon, but we're getting better. When we look at travel in general, do we understand this various sources of carbon emissions well now? Do we have all the technique and knowledge and technology to do so?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. I would say we have a good understanding, but not a perfect understanding. So when it comes to measuring the carbon footprint of a holiday, I'm looking at every single element of that adventure: the flight, the airport transfer, the hotel, the activity on day 3, breakfast on day 6. All of those things annoyingly have a carbon footprint and go into your carbon footprint of your travel company or your holiday or whatever we're looking at that time. The sources of carbon typically comes from energy, and energy can be in the shape of electricity, it could be petrol, it could be diesel, it could be gas, it could be lots of other different fuels. Even air conditioning units emit this kind of refrigerants, and that is also a type of fossil fuel that goes into the air. So all of these things, basically, whenever we use them, emit carbon and other gases into the air, causing this world to get warmer and warmer and warmer. And when I'm measuring a trip, I have to kind of work out what's going on. I would say for the bulk of these things, we're pretty good at that. We can look at, say, well, how much fuel does that plane use when it flies from A to B? How much fuel does a car typically use when it goes from the airport in Hanoi to the city center hotel? How much electricity and air conditioning is that hotel using? Someone is paying the bills for these fuels, and so their information is there. Where will it get a little bit complicated is perhaps smaller things that are coming up here, there, and everywhere. So, for example, we're getting so many questions at the moment about what is the carbon footprint of AI. If I started to have an AI chatbot on my website, does that increase my emissions? And if I'm being honest with you, that's a little bit where me and my community are a little bit like, I'm not 100% sure how I'm meant to measure the carbon footprint of AI. So we're kind of guessing to some extent what we think it would be. My message I want to get across on this question, though, is do not use this kind of uncertainty to not do action. We can definitely measure 90% accuracy when it comes to the trips, and we know what those results will then be in terms of what those actions should be. So don't use the fact that my answer to AI isn't very good at the moment as an excuse to do nothing, because actually, when we're looking at holidays, AI is not actually an issue in our industry. And actually, we should be focusing on how can we fly better? How can we stay in hotels that have got a lower footprint? How can we get from A to B in a smarter form of transport that emits less fuel on the way and therefore lower carbon emissions?
Are we better at also standardizing these metrics on carbon across the travel sector? Is everybody speaking the same language, helping the benchmarking? Is that something that's happening as well?
I'm probably biased. I would say yes, but I think many of the people that we work with would say no. But what I would say is there's been a lot of progress and it's moving in the right direction. And there's been a lot of confusion in the past. And so what I would say is that it's a bit of a cheesy saying, but we're on a journey and things are moving in the right direction. So when I say one company is saying the carbon footprint of this holiday is this, and another company says our holiday has a carbon footprint of that, we're getting closer to say, well, actually, they are fair comparisons between X and Y to the extent a customer can see the carbon footprint label of one to another and make an informed decision. But
so
there is work to do.
Things are getting better, but there's some work to be done still.
Yeah.
Okay, this is it's across the board on sustainability in tourism, of course. Thanks so much. Let's explore what separates genuine impact from good intention. So, Daniel, at the Reset Tourism Fund, you're putting money behind carbon solutions. We've talked about this right at the beginning. Do you use criteria that sort of shows you the impact, so genuine carbon impact reduction, for example, from, I don't know, product that maybe are trying to greenwash their way? You know, we have in tourism quite a bit of that. And can you share perhaps a few examples of what's working on the ground, perhaps even with the EXO partners?
Yeah. So, I mean, our work at the Reset Tourism Fund, we work alongside a lot of these SMEs around the world. And so, I think when it comes to, measuring what that impact looks like, we do try to keep it pretty simple. And that could vary, right? Because there's so many different ways to measure impact, from the sustainability side, or it could be the community impact side. Typically, we tend to ask a set of, different questions. I think, for the sake of this conversation, maybe we could just focus on a few of those. But, to start off, it's like, can that impact be measured? Is this a project that benefits the local community? And also, is this a project that can be scaled, just beyond the initial pilot? Coming back to the statistic that I mentioned earlier about the long-tail boats in Thailand, this is part of our partnership with the EXO Foundation. We're working together to, invest in some of these smaller suppliers that EXO Travel is working with, and creating an opportunity for them to become more sustainable with some of this financing. And so, to come back to this example, this is a business based in Thailand called the Positive Group, and I think their work is pretty interesting, right? Because it's a small operator that came up with a solution for an electric boat, really just kind of replacing the engine, and to look back at just how this company has measured that impact is so. They went out, they did the research, they've tracked it, not just through their own operations, but also just looking, at the data throughout the country. And so, all this data is coming from them. So I had to actually write this down to make sure that I got it correct. But so around 44,000 tons of carbon is emitted each year from, these small long-tail boat operators. I think in Thailand, there's around 4,000 long-tail boats being operated. So this is also just enough to power a small city. And so, what this business has done is that they've actually tracked, what that fuel consumption and emissions look like, and then compared it to what, their solution for the EV boat looks like. So, to just take an example, so a standard 20-kilometer trip with diesel produces around 44 kilos of carbon, which, let's say could power a few homes in the US, which probably is not saying much, but per day, whereas the EV boat produces less than 2 kilos. So, it's a huge reduction, something that can be tracked. And imagine now this solution being implemented at scale with all the other long-tail boat operators in Thailand. And to even look just beyond the, let's say, the carbon footprint, they also monitor the water quality levels to ensure that, some of this fuel is not leaking into the rivers and the bays and the waterways in Thailand. Another really interesting data point that they shared with us, which kind of comes into community impact and how tourism is, impacting the people that live in the communities that we're bringing travelers to, is that the engine shows that the electric engine and the noise testing shows that there was a reduction of 90% in the noise levels. And so this is actually a huge issue because 83% of the boat operators in Thailand suffer hearing damage from being exposed to the engines on a daily basis. And, even coming back and thinking about, yes, we can talk about all the incredible, things that come out of businesses becoming more sustainable, but there's also just, it makes sense financially. And so, they ran the numbers. And so, costs for these operators have fallen from 480 baht, which is like roughly 13 US dollars, to just 18 baht, or around 50 cents US dollars per day. So I think if you're a small operator, this is a huge margin that's eating into your profits, right? And so, I think that coming back to the question, it's like, how do we really track this impact? And, how can small operators, how can we help them in becoming more sustainable and being able to measure that and convey the benefits, not just, for the environment or the community, but also just financially for the business as well.
Is it always about impact that can be measured and tracked quantitatively, that is with data and stats and numbers? Are there, I'm just thinking about this statement you've made about the noise, for example. So this reduction of noise, which I would imagine is something that for the quality of life for people is quite, right, it's quite precious to actually not have noise. Is this, I mean, do you keep track as well of things that are harder to measure within with the work that you do, so the more qualitative almost aspect of impact?
Yeah, and I think, yeah, in some cases we do, right? And you know, every business that we're working with at the Reset Tourism Fund is different, right? Like in this case, you know, we could be talking about somebody who's operating these, you know, waterway trips. It could be an eco lodge. It could be a supply chain procurement platform. And so I think, you know, the data points that each of these businesses are measuring, you know, is just going to be different. You know, and I think also part of our work at the Reset Tourism Fund is that, you know, we recognize that there are some hurdles for these businesses to track that. But you know, I think a lot of that stuff, you know, just can't be, let's say, you know, when I'm speaking to some of these businesses and interviewing them, and you know, really understanding, you know, the impact. You know, there's also a lot of personal stories behind some of this work, and so you know, it's, you know, I try not to reduce everything to just a data point. You know, because the reality is just far more complex. And so, yeah, you know, we look at a number of different things, but we also try not to be too rigorous in how you know, we are assessing those businesses.
Understandable. Yeah. Building on this, Lydia, turn back to you. So we just heard from Daniel also about the cost point here, the massive reduction in cost actually of operation. When you're working with hotels, what would be the most cost-effective carbon reduction strategy for operators, perhaps that they overlook? And so that's perhaps the first question. The second question, because you do so much on the upfront design and planning, what is needed in that sustainable design right from the start?
Yeah, so actually, I'm going to flip your questions around.
Okay.
And
Yep.
answer the design part first. And actually, it comes back down, what we talked about is integrative design process to get everyone around the table. You're defining your goals. And also what tends to be overlooked is passive architectural design. So what helps with passive design is that, you know, instead of budgeting things like very expensive systems, active systems, they're called, you know, like expensive HVAC or solar panels that have to be installed, you're actually neglecting the very free, low-cost strategies that are out there that kind of reduce the demand in the first place, right? So you're doing things like optimizing orientation. You are creating strategic shading. So with orientation, you can actually, you know, minimize solar heat gain or maximize, like in the hot climates. In cold climates, you want to maximize that. And then this is essentially free design work. You orient your structure in one way, and then you can slash heating and cooling loads by up to 20%, by minimum 20%. And then with shading, you know, you can you push back your windows, you can reduce solar heat gain. So that reduces any kind of energy loads that have to work so hard to cool the space or warm the space. And then lastly, if you think about natural ventilation and daylighting, by maximizing your openings, like creating bigger windows or smaller windows in strategic locations, then that can actually regulate a lot of daylight you need. And also these windows should be operable. So then you actually can create like a cross ventilation that then you are actually not having to need any kind of cooling in the space or heating as necessary. So this is a concept where you're actually designing carbon out of the problem rather than paying to fix it actually quite heftily later on. So that is, yeah, that's the design part, you know, like just.
Yeah, no, and that's like, it's such a great one. I mean, it's music to my ears a little bit. Would you say that when I look at my grandparents and generation before that, when energy wasn't cheap, a lot of thought process went into how do I orient my house and which room gets the sun, which one doesn't, etc. A lot of the passive design was actually, we've had, I don't know, hundreds of years of history with this, but then suddenly got cheap energy. And it's almost as if we've lost all of that, but we're gaining it back now. Would you argue?
Yes, I mean, it's also, you know, there's a big resurgence of vernacular architecture, and vernacular is designing sort of the traditional methods of the space. So, you know, mud huts, things like that, like traditionally where they've created or even concepts of courtyards or a water feature in the middle of a courtyard in a very hot, arid climate, because you're then cooling the space passively without any kind of additional active system. So yeah, we're really going back to the past because we're finding that they didn't have these active systems and they had to make it work for life.
Yeah. So would you say that that's linked then to my first question, which was the most effective carbon reduction strategy?
Yeah. Yes. So of course, this is something very easily said when you're starting the project from scratch or you're actually doing something, but when you have a physical building that's standing there, you really need to think about what other strategies that can be. So things that are adding in, at retrofit, the active technologies. But going back to what Daniel said, actually measuring. I think when you have an operational building, the most important data you can get is all your tracking. Because once you know what your baseline is, you're actually going to be able to identify what fixes or what inefficiencies there are.
Mm. So if let's say you are operating a building that's standing and you don't have quite the options yet, you still hook on the grid, and you passive is maybe you have to do lots of modification. Anyways, it's maybe not in the books for now. You might turn to carbon offsetting. So Charlie, I'm turning to you. Carbon offsetting gets a lot of criticism in tourism. We've seen over the past years is really quite a bit of bad press. How do you help business navigate the difference between offsetting sort of as a band-aid, right? Sort of I emit, but then I offset this stuff, versus offsetting as a genuine strategy. And I guess I just go on. What would you say to tourism businesses regarding offsetting?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. So I would say there's currently 3 strategies travel companies are currently doing when it comes to carbon. Some of them are offsetting their footprint, so they're trying to estimate their footprint each year, and they're spending the amount of offsets equal to how much they think they've emitted in the last year. So let's say they say every single year we're going to spend $10,000 to offset our footprint and call ourselves carbon neutral. The other strategy, which I much prefer, is where they say we're going to take ownership of our footprint. We're going to say, yes, we have a carbon footprint just like every other company, but we are going to make changes internally to change how we design our business, how we design our adventures, so that they come with a smaller and smaller carbon footprint each year. I think that strategy is far smarter than offsetting it, because actually you're just kind of carrying on as normal, but you're just paying this fee each year. And I think a net zero one, back to Lydia's point again about cost effectiveness, is about kind of spending that money on the business rather than someone else and some other carbon project elsewhere in the world. Now, to make it more complicated, I did say there was 3 strategies. The third one, which is unfortunately is the most common, is do nothing at all, which is what most companies are doing out there. So of those 3 strategies, I'd much rather you offset your footprint than do nothing. But if you are offsetting your footprint, I really like the finance team to see it like a self-imposed tax, which they don't want to pay next year. We use this idea of offsetting to kind of encourage the team to make sure they have a smaller footprint, so you have to offset less every single year. But if you're unsure what to do and you're kind of listening to this call thinking what makes sense for my business, you do not have to offset your footprint. What you need to do is work out how can we operate in 2026 with a slightly smaller footprint than you did this year.
So great distinction between reduction and offsetting. And of course, maybe we can tackle a little bit sort of the bigger elephant in the room. I guess it's money, because in working throughout reduction, maybe there's investment need to be done. I mean, even if I want to be more energy efficient by changing my lamps, my LED, I still have to invest in those LEDs. So, I'm looking at how do businesses, especially smaller operators in our industry, actually fund those reduction initiatives. Daniel, let's turn to you and talk about money. What would you say is that the biggest barrier preventing SMEs, so small, medium-sized enterprise here in our sector, from accessing carbon reduction funding? Is that knowledge? Is it what's happening here regarding finding the money, and how is Reset Tourism Fund addressing this?
Yeah. So, I mean, Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a number of different ways that we can approach this, right? And so, you know, a lot of my work revolves around speaking to some of these business owners and really trying to understand like what some of their goals are, like where are they trying to get to, like how are they trying to be more sustainable and how we could get them there. And so, you know, I don't think that, you know, thinking of some of these SMEs, you know, it's not really about their motivation or their desire to become more sustainable, but, you know, coming back to the question, it's like, where do they access, you know, the right type of financing in order to do it? You know, and a lot of this financing is really designed for, you know, bigger climate or sustainability initiatives, let's say for like a corporation and not necessarily like a family run lodge or a 10-person tour operator. And so, you know, there's and you know, I think when they might be going that route to secure some of that more traditional financing, you know, there's a number of hurdles that they run into, especially when we're talking about the tourism sector. And so, you know, one of them could be that the loan sizes or that the repayment terms don't necessarily match the seasonality of tourism, right? There's a high season, there's a low season. It's not always feasible for these businesses to have a fixed repayment and have to pay that in a low season, right? And so, you know, one of our solutions at the Reset Tourism Fund to kind of combat this is our revenue-based financing model, where businesses just pay back a percentage of what comes in every quarter. And so when low season comes around, you know, they're not stressing out about, wait a second, I have this fixed payment that I have to repay. And, you know, it's just the rainy season here, wherever I'm at, right? You know, I think another one of the big hurdles that those businesses run to is just, you know, the collateral that's required to even secure a loan or really to secure some of this financing. And, you know, that's not always something that a small business that's operating, you know, from season to season is able to provide. And so, you know, for all of our investees, you know, we don't require any collateral for the loan. You know, so for them, that's also like a huge value add. And then I think also like another key element here, especially if we're coming back to how, you know, things are being tracked, is that a lot of these smaller businesses don't necessarily have the sustainability teams in place to do this measurement and to do this tracking and to really go out and capture that data and then, you know, share that with, you know, whoever the funders may be. You know, fortunately for us at the On Tours Foundation, I have to give a shout out to my colleague and our director of impact, Sarah, who is Sarah Payne, who's really instrumental to the work we do. But you know, she has a really strong background in you know, sustainability and carbon measurement, and so you know, she's the one that comes in and helps a lot of these businesses actually measure that, so that they're not buried in the data, which would just be another hurdle for them in order to secure this funding and come back with that reporting. And so, you know, I think through our model, you know, traditional debt, you know, can be useful in some cases, but you know, I think when we're looking at the tourism sector, it's probably not like always the solution that makes the most sense for a lot of these small businesses on the ground. And you know, what we do differently is we have this philanthropic model that, you know, we've been working on for 30 years. And so we've kind of, with the Reset Tourism Fund, what we've done is that we've partnered with a lot of these incredible partners, corporate partners like EXO Travel and the EXO Foundation that, you know, really come in with that capital and, you know, allow this financing to come with less risk for the businesses. So essentially like EXO Foundation, you know, de-risking the investment for those businesses and their partners and really allowing those small businesses to become more sustainable without the burden of, you know, everything else that might come with a more traditional pathway to funding.
Excellent. I mean, funding mechanism that clearly makes or breaks implementation for many of those small players, and you're obviously opening the door to those SMEs to actually make that happen, which is pretty amazing. Charlie, can you tell us a little bit about tour operators as well as their customers? What are they happy to spend money on when it comes to making sort of positive impact at the destinations they promote? Is that part of, you know, what makes most sense in terms of euros or dollars to spend on in positive impact? What is your experience here?
Yeah, so in my experience, I think the first thing I should mention is that most tour operators based here in the UK or Australia or America are happy to spend money. So I think that's worth kind of noting. Most of them, when it comes to this kind of world, are spending it on offsets. But if I talk to them internally, they do it a little bit begrudgingly. They kind of know in the back of their mind, they wish they could spend that money on something else. And so what we typically do is we pitch to them to be like, you know, you can spend that $10,000 each year you spend on offsets on your supply chain, on your favorite DMCs, on the hotels your customers go to, on the experiences that you have. And they all love that idea, but then they stop and they think, well, where? They struggle with that kind of entrepreneurial spirits to try and find those opportunities. And actually, going back to Daniel's earlier point, I loved it. I took a note of it. I think that's a perfect example of where I could see tour operators being excited to spend money to help that long boat company switch to EV, as long as they get to tell the story, which is now our trips have a smaller footprint because the activity on the long tail boat now has a smaller carbon footprint. We've also had these other benefits in terms of your experience on that day is going to have a quieter, more relaxing feel to it. That's also going to benefit the health of the captain of that boat because he's not going to have ear problems the rest of his life. And it's also hopefully then also going to save money in the long term because maybe that experience might become cheaper with those lower operating costs, or perhaps because I'm going to help fund that switch, I might get a discount for the first 2 years, for example, every time my customer goes on that. So there's lots of desire from tour operators to spend money on their supply chain, where their customers are going, what their customers are touching and seeing on the ground. And as long as we can find those scenarios where it benefits the customer, it benefits the local business, and it reduces emissions at the same time, they absolutely love it. They just are struggling with trying to find those at the moment. So what I really like about what EXO are doing today is kind of showing that there is stuff happening out there already. It's just trying to help connect those dots with the right local businesses and the kind of the tour operator.
All right, so we'll explore the solutions and actions in a minute from now. Just before we do that transition to talk about best practices and solutions, a quick round on what's one myth about carbon and tourism that needs to die in 2025. Do you have anything, a myth that needs to die about carbon and tourism in 2025, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think, I just try to apply this to everything, but, it kind of touches up on some of the points that Charlie's mentioned throughout the conversation is that, I think that there is a myth that like a lot of these small actions don't matter. I often feel that, when we look out at the task at hand, it feels intimidating. You look at these big numbers and, if you're a small business out there, it's like, well, what am I possibly able to do that can actually, carve out a little chunk of like what this, big, I guess, impact is that is being made. And so, I think for me, it's really about like all these small choices adding up. We don't have to have this whole big grand act, but it's like, where are we sourcing the soap for our hotel from? Where are we, sourcing the food from? Where, how are we transporting our travelers around? And so, I think that, if I'm approaching it from the perspective of the SMEs that we work with, it's like, every little small action counts, right? Especially in compounding and actually making a difference in the bigger picture. And so, yeah,
it's good. It's great. Thank you so much. Every action counts. Okay. Thank you so much. Lydia, what's one myth that needs to die?
I'm going to copy Charlie a little bit, but offsets, right? So offsets are a last resort, not a first strategy. So like structural decarbonization within the operations and investing in renewable energy and retrofitting, I think that is the key thing. Like looking at your supply chain, exactly what Daniel said, because everything has come off as, oh, I'll just pay a carbon offset and I'm guilt-free.
Awesome. Thank you. Charlie, one myth that needs to die in 2025.
The one that frustrates me the most is that we're too busy to work on our carbon footprint this year. We're kind of sleepwalking into this every year, and I hear the same excuse every single year. I understand it, but I completely disagree with it because we need action to start happening today.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much. So because real world success stories shows us that meaningful carbon reduction isn't just aspirational, but it's achievable, we've seen today with the awards. Let's turn to those best practices. We'll close the panel with this. Lydia, can you share perhaps some success story, hotel tourism business that really has made a tremendous or dramatic carbon reduction? Was there a secret sauce or was just commitment? What was it?
I mean, it goes to, for me, like the biggest one I've seen sort of on recurrence is the ITC Hotel Group in India. And they are literally, through conviction, systematically have changed their whole group and have created the largest chain of LEED Platinum certified hotels globally. So they've been going on for between 16 and 21 years, progressively and systematically doing projects that have allowed them to get net zero certification. So they do, renewable energy plants on site, and they own their own solar wind farms. So they really have created something where they can generate their own renewable energy with any excess fed back into the grid. And then with water, they've achieved the world's first net zero water and have become water positive in their hotels because, again, through conviction, they are comprehensively, sorting out their wastewater treatments and then also capturing rainwater that actually can replenish the underground aquifers. So, secret sauce, instead of buying, offsets somewhere, renewable energy credits, they thought, why don't we create something in our own community, in our own space that we actually have influence, and we generate this energy that can go right back into our hotels, clear direct impact. They didn't view, sustainability as some add-on later on. They went into the core of the design. They said every renovation must account for materials that were local, materials that had recyclable content, can be recycled, what could be used from the demolition process into the new, project. And so, not the secret sauce summary really is to not treat sustainability as some marketing exercise, but you treat it as a business driver, a business strategy that then you can prove that luxury, not only luxury, but just hotel business, when you can do these radical carbon reductions, it doesn't have to be some sacrifice. It's just taking it into account at the start and going into it with that mindset.
Yeah, love to hear about those tangible wins. That's really great. Daniel, if I turn to you, and this is going to be interesting for the audience, what's the most innovative carbon solutions you've funded through Reset Tourism that other operators should know about? What would be the one?
Yeah, so I mean, so we'll have to take a step back from Asia for this part of the conversation. So we'll head over to Africa, and one of the investees that we've worked with, which I mean I love sharing this example. It's called Kajani Supplies, based in Kenya. And so what they've done is they've built pretty much like a one-stop shop procurement hub for safari lodges in the Masai Mara, where they can source everything they need, from fresh food to cooking fuel for off-grid camps, body care products, cleaning products, just about everything that you might need to stock a lodge. And, I guess the old model would be that a lot of these safari lodges out in the Masai Mara would have to travel all the way to Nairobi and back, which is around like 500 kilometers journey, just to go and restock the lodge. And then on top of that, they might be working with a number of different suppliers in Nairobi. And so, moving around the city to even try and source and find all these things. And so just imagine, when you're talking about the hundreds of lodges that exist in the Masai Mara, the amount of emissions that comes from that, the amount of packaging waste, and really, there's always been a more simple solution and way of doing this. And so what Kajani has done is that they've really gone ahead and consolidated a lot of those orders from the lodges, and sourced from local producers, whether that's from the food or, all the other amenities that might be needed. They bring that back to their fulfillment center, which is solar powered, and deliver that in bulk to all the different lodges. And so at the moment, they work with over 125 safari lodges in the Masai Mara. And so, when we're thinking about our supply chain, we often overlook a lot of those small details, which I try to make the theme of, my piece of the conversation today. But, these are little things that we tend to overlook. And, what they've gone ahead and done, I think, is remarkable, and something that, when we're looking at all these different destinations around the world, is like sorely needed. It sometimes just feels also decentralized. And really to kind of see it put together in this way, is really inspiring for us. And, just thinking about the impact, and I'll have to get back to you on the data points for them. But, it's really a massive impact that they're having there in Kenya, in Masai Mara.
This is great. What a great story. Very, very cool innovation. Thank you so much for sharing. Charlie, if you would have a magic wand and change one thing about how tourism approaches carbon, what would it be?
It would probably be similar to Lydia's view. I don't like the idea of looking at reducing your carbon footprint as a sacrifice. We're taking things out of the itinerary, we're making it worse, we're making it more boring. I actually think at the moment there's a massive opportunity for travel companies to think about how do we design adventures. Whenever I look at a brochure or talk to customers, their favorite moments are relaxing by the pool, the time on the beach, the cycling ride on day 4. These are all the images that people get sold to, and these are the things people talk about when they get home. It's not the flight out there. It's not the kind of transfer or minibus for 6 hours to the mountains. So what I'd love travel designers and itineraries to start doing more of, if I have my magic wand, is to think about how can I design itineraries so there's more time spent doing the things that people love, which tend to have a lower carbon footprint than flying from A to B to C to D to E to A to F to G to D and then back home again.
Fantastic. I just came back from a very long bike ride and that's the journey is much more than the destination. You're happy to get there, but really it's about the journey. Yeah, thanks very much. We're approaching the end of this time with us together. I want to leave the audience perhaps with something concrete that they can act on immediately, but we've already had quite a few tips from you, which has been pretty amazing. So I've got one final challenge for you, and I call this sort of maybe your carbon compass, a North Star of some sort. So here's the question: if a tourism business could only focus on one carbon action, we have plenty here in the audience. So if a tourism business could only focus on one carbon action this year, what should it be? One sentence, maximum impact. Let's start with you, Charlie.
We see the biggest impact with the companies you work with is you have to just set a target. I don't even care what it is, but you're going to say this time by next year, I am going to have achieved this. And then you're going to say, I am then going to release the results to my colleagues on this date in a year's time. So making yourself accountable is my one
making
action.
yourself accountable.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Lydia.
Okay, I won't steal from the guys, but local partnerships for me, making yourself accountable. But once you create your baseline, you should identify the local partners, whether it be in finishes, furniture, food, goods. I think local partnerships is where you need to like start really, collaborating and working with them.
Set a target, get local. Daniel, we finish with you.
Yeah, and so to build on what Lydia was saying, yeah, source local. I mean, not only is it more sustainable, but you're also supporting people in the community and entrepreneurs in the community that, are really benefiting from, let's say, tourism and people coming there. So, think about how you can source local and be more sustainable, but also really just bring more of that impact to the community and make sure that they feel the positive impacts of tourism as well.
Thank you so much. Incredible panel for showing up. Basically, you've shown us that tackling carbon, I mean, it isn't rocket science. It isn't brain surgery. And it isn't just about footprint. It's about funding. It's about innovation. It's about the courage to act. I think you've shown that as well. And I think it was very inspiring. Thank you so much. I perhaps I want to leave you with a quote. There's a quote from an activist called Rebecca Solnit. It's about hope, because often in these times where there is a little bit of hopelessness, we talk sometimes about hope. And she's great because she said, hope is not a lottery ticket you can sit on a sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. Hope is an axe you break down doors with an emergency. And I quite like that. I think you've shown us today this very much. Thank you so much, Charlie, Lydia, Daniel, for being here. And I hand it back to Charlotte for the end of this ceremony. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Well, thank you, Willie, for guiding us so thoughtfully through today's ceremony and panel discussion. And thank you, of course, to our judges and panelists for sharing such valuable insights. Very much appreciated. This year, I wanted to add that it has been a very important year for EXO Travel. Because for the very first time, we calculated our full scope 1, 2, and 3 emission, moving from a narrow view of only our direct emission to full visibility across our footprint, with particularly the support of one of our partner, Charlie at eCollective. And with this knowledge, we can now shift from measurement to strategy, setting pathways and targets that help us drive meaningful reductions. Alongside this, we've also, together with EXO Foundation and Daniel here, looked at our carbon fund that has allowed us to move from words to action. So our initiative, the Reset Tourism Fund, helped us to decarbonize and to target our supply chain into investing in greener solutions. So we're also very happy to be accompanying them, accompanying our suppliers into moving forward. We also acknowledge that some emissions cannot yet be eliminated, unfortunately. For these, we remain committed to offsetting at EXO, but we also do this very carefully by taking the time to identify the right partners, ensuring that the project we support are not only credible and transparent, but also bring real benefit to the communities on the ground in our destinations. So today's discussion has also shown us that tackling carbon is not only about numbers, it's about responsibility, innovation, collaboration across the entire value chain, and about courage, as you were saying, Willy. And so on behalf of EXO Travel and EXO Foundation, I would like to thank you all for joining us on this journey today, also on this ceremony. Together through initiatives like the Carbon Fund and a lot of other initiatives, we can continue to drive and have meaningful impact. So thank you everyone who has been with us today. Wishing you a wonderful end of the day, and see you next year for the 4th edition of the Sustainability Awards.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Charlotte. Bye.
Bye-bye, Willy. Bye, everyone.